Chapter 6. The Black Forest, in which the families escape from the army and a terrible thing happens in the woods. The woods were haunted with every sort of malign creature. It was an evil place fit only for ghosts, bogies, and fell spirits. Of this, Max was becoming more certain by the minute. A few hours after nightfall on the previous evening, the pipers, the peeps, and all of the servants and hired hands slipped into the woods. Not one of them elected to stay behind and take a chance with the invaders. They divided into 3 smaller groups in order to better negotiate the woods, which were too thick and tangled to permit the passage of a larger company. The pipers joined with the peep family to form one group, the household staff formed another, and the field hands and other outside workers formed the third. Each person carried a similar bundle containing only the essentials to survive the forest, some food salvaged from the estate's larders, warm clothes or a blanket to endure the cold of night, a weapon if they had one, and a small bag of shiny gold marks, divided equally from Squire Peep's entire cache of ready money, which had been hidden well enough that the invaders never discovered it. Peep had decided that each individual should carry his own purse, so that even if they became separated, everyone who survived the forest to eventually win through to Hamlin had an equal chance not to have to live from there on as a penniless beggar. Throughout the remainder of the previous day, after Peep had outlined his plan, household servants plied the few soldiers left behind with wine and beer and strong spirits, which they still had in plenty, since the officers loudly refused to allow any of it to be confiscated with the other goods. It seemed they wouldn't risk an army of drunken soldiers when marching on a town to take it by force of arms. Even after the guards had consumed their fill, grateful to be refreshed against the hot day, the housemaids urged more on them, saying, "This is the season when dire infirmities are staved off only by stiff drink and plenty of it." Knowing no better in a strange land, the soldiers drank more and then more again. True to their scheme, all of the guards fell asleep even as the night fell, and the escape was underway. The first group had set off with Squire Peep in the lead. They'd moved slowly, more slowly than the other 2 groups, who quickly outdistanced them to become lost from sight, because the woods were thick, and Mr. Peep was fat and old and couldn't do better. Plus the entire gaggle of Peep daughters seemed intent on tripping and stumbling or becoming engaged in one thorny stand of underground after another. They cried and complained so often that Max nearly forgot how pretty they were, even in their rough, durable work clothes, and how in the previous afternoon 3 or 4 of them had already played a part in his private imaginings of how this escape might turn out. In each case, he'd bravely rescued one of them from some fierce creature of the deep woods, killing the beast or driving it off with a sword. Then the girl in question had shown her gratitude, flinging herself into his arms and madly covering him with unending kisses, as well as rewarding him in other ways that Max couldn't quite conjure in his mind but knew were among the secret doings of grown men and women. Max had a sword now, a real one this time, and not just some flimsy object mounted for display. Mr. Peep had given it to him on the very edge of the woods, just before they ventured inside. "You're one of the 3 men in this group," Peep whispered to him, "so we'll need you armed, like your father and me." "I'm one of the men," Max thought. That's what fat old Mr. Peep called me, and it was true. He'd experienced a heady sense of elation then, which was only improved when he saw that they hadn't armed Peter in a similar fashion. "I'm one of the men now, and Peter isn't." Max belted the sheathed blade around his hips and decided, no, it was more of a solemn vow than a simple decision, that his true life had only begun with their entrance into the woods. He hadn't had an opportunity at the time to take the blade out and examine it. The woods were too dark and thick, and since then his joy at having it was dimmed when the sword in its sheath seemed determined to catch on every high root or low branch. For what must have been many miles, the sword, like the heavy pack on his back, became nothing more than another burden to be wrestled through the forest. The group walked single file, and Max had been assigned to guard its rear. "Squire Peep and I will watch for dangers ahead," his father had said, "and you must look for those that might try to sneak up on us from behind. I hope you realize what a great trust we've placed in you, son." Max did. He knew his father trusted him enough to risk his life guarding a line of screeching, squabbling girls, but not enough to reward him with frost, which was his birthright. So Max walked in the rear, making his plans and biding his time, his resentment growing toward every one of those in front of him, who could have warned him about this root or that whipping branch, or any other of an endless number of invisible obstacles in his path. But they didn't, and so he entered every further misdeed into his mind's ledger against that time when all accounts would be balanced. They'd walk throughout the night, and then, after too short a rest, throughout the day that followed. Day was almost as dark as night under the wood's canopy. It was ever and always a shadowed, haunted place. Max had heard every manner of hoot and caw and grunt of beasts, and once even a growl of something not too distant, which had so frightened him that he froze in place for so long that he nearly lost the rest of the group ahead of him. He only found himself able to move again when he heard the thing pad off, away from him, grunting quietly with every heavy step. And now, at the commencement of the second evening, they stopped to make a real camp, to sleep for the entire night before setting off again with a new day. They lit a fire and built it up into a big one, to keep them warm and the beasts away, unconcerned that there'd be soldiers to spot it, not this far into the woods. "I think we are distant enough to be safe from pursuit," Mr. Peep said. "No army is likely to enter the terrifying untouched parts of the Black Forest simply to chase a few scattered runaways. We didn't harm any of their men before we fled, and as far as they know, we didn't make off with any great treasure. I think they'll be content to let the forest have us." Mr. Peep had also said some confusing, arcane things about finding their way by examining which side of the trees had moss growing on them. This made no sense to Max, but seemed to please the others that Peep knew his business. "And I can only do that by daylight," Mr. Peep said. "So we'll have to stop at night from now on. Otherwise, we'd have no way of reconfirming which way is west, and might become forever lost in these great woods. Remember, west to the river, and then upstream to Hamlin Town. That's our plan." While Mother and Mrs. Peep worked to fashion their dinner out of the supplies they carried, and the daughters chatted and complained and pulled off their boots to examine their poor feet, Max sat apart on a moss-crowned rock and thought his thoughts, which alternated between despair and wary satisfaction. At that moment, he went over in his mind every frightening tale he'd ever heard of what lurked in the depths of the Black Forest. There were ghosts out here, spirits of the dishonored dead, doomed to spend eternity in this evil place, feasting on the souls of those who wander into it. And there were witches, who conjured evil spells and ate children as their only diet. And there were giants and ogres and every other sort of monster. What was the thing that had come so close to me in the night? Max asked himself. He could still hear every note of its rumbling growl, a noise that could only be made by something big and deadly. It was a foolhardy decision to enter this place, and his father should never have allowed it. Then again, father's judgment had also been demonstrably faulty in other ways of late. How could he give Frost to Peter and not to him? And then Max considered the other hand. I was reborn here, in these woods, which couldn't have happened elsewhere. Before, I was only Max Piper, a simple flute player in a family of vagabond minstrels. Now, I'm Max the swordsman, who saved Ariane and Bridget and young Alfred with the pretty blue eyes from any number of dangers so far, simply by guarding the rear of our line against them. I stood alone and faced down the growling thing until the others could get away, which is how he resolved to remember the fearful incident from now on. So he looked at the bright side, even as he looked at the bright blade of the sword lying across his lap, now that he was finally able to study it. It was thin and sharp, and just the right size, almost as if it had been made for him personally. Max had never held a real sword before, but like any child of the age, he practiced often with sticks. He knew that one chopped with its edge and thrust with its tip. That was enough for the basics, and everything else was just a matter of practice and refinement. He would practice and grow ever more sure and deft with his blade until every villain feared Max the swordsman and every good man respected him. A sword this grand needs a name, Max thought, and it was then that he looked up across the fire and knew what his blade must be called. On the other side of Max, by the light of the crackling fire, Father was showing Peter some of the intricacies of his new flute. Frost was the only item not directly essential to survival that Father or Mr. Peep would allow anyone to take with them, and then only because Father had whispered a few family secrets into Mr. Peep's ear, no doubt telling him that Peter could use the flute to make danger pass them by. Yes, Max knew that story, because many times in the past, when he was supposed to have been long asleep, Max had lain awake to hear Father and Mother murmur to each other in the night. In most ways, Frost is no different from any other flute, Father said, but look here at its mouthpiece. It's so sharp, Peter said. Why? I'm not sure, but perhaps it needed to be carved just so in order to achieve the sweet and perfect notes that only Frost is capable of playing. Or perhaps ancient Jorg, being as great a warrior as he was a musician, thought that one should pay a price for the opportunity to play so wondrous an instrument. But whatever the reason, you have to be ever careful as you play, or Frost will cut you. See these tiny scars on the corners of my mouth? Max had seen them many times before, just as Peter had. They were nearly invisible at all times, and would be extra hard to see by flickering firelight. Nevertheless, Peter leaned forward to intently study them, just as though he'd never noticed them before. Good little Peter, always quick to do anything Father asks. Yes, Peter said. Frost usually got me when I became too caught up in the music I was making to worry about my safety. Sometimes there's just no way to prevent it. You pay it blood for those magical moments when you're reaching for true greatness in your music, just as I have. Was it worth it, Father? Every time. Father continued, giving Peter his lesson, and good little Peter gave him rapt attention, as he always did. Max smiled to see Peter's bruised face, with one eye so wonderfully blackened that it had nearly swollen shut. I did that to you, Peter, Max thought, and that's just the start. And neither father nor Peter took any notice of Max, or had the faintest clue that just a feet away from them, across the revealing flame, Max had just named his sword Frost Taker. The fire had burned low, and all were asleep, except Max, who'd been woken an hour ago to replace Squire Peep as their guard. Max the swordsman, brave wielder of fabled Frost Taker, was on duty. That's who he was now. But he'd also become something else, something stronger and more frightening than just another hero of legend. He sat his watch and peered outwardly to be sure, but he also observed the others as they slept under their blankets, cloaks or coats huddled in a closed circle around the fire. Mother and father slept together, wrapped up in a shared blanket. Mother had suffered in the day and night before. He'd seen it in the weary sagging of her shoulders and in her eyes, which no longer shined with the delight she took in nearly every day of her life. Her world was gone. She lost it when they turned away from their caravan wagon, filled with drums and bells and a beloved wooden xylophone. The fact that she now carried in her purse more gold than she'd ever had in her life, more than the total worth of all that she'd left behind, and that father, Max, and Peter each had an amount to match, was of no comfort to her. That wagon was her home, and it was gone forever. But she never complained, not once. Mother wasn't the type. Mr. and Mrs. Peep also slept together. He was so large, and she was plump enough in her own right, that they could barely get their arms around each other, but somehow they managed it. The Peep daughters slept in one great extended bundle. Some covers had been kicked off in the night, lying as they were so near the warmth of the fire. Max could see the fascinating curve of one girl's body, or the flutter of an eyelid, or the delicate quiver of another girl's perfectly formed and achingly lovely lip as she breathed in and out. Many times he reached out, almost touching one of them, before drawing back his hand. Not now, he thought. I'll wait for the right time, which will be soon enough. And here was Peter, the only one sleeping alone under his coat. Poor little Peter, who was out in the woods on a great adventure with his dear little sweetheart Bo, but unable to enjoy it. Even now he can't touch her, Max thought, like I know he wants to. It wouldn't be proper. And Peter is nothing if not always proper and good. But I could touch the little piggy girl right now if I wished. But I don't wish, because she's not among the ones I want. Bratty little Bo was sleeping just a few feet away from Peter, so enticingly close, on the outside edge of the tangle of Peep daughters. How Peter will wail and cry when he sees what happens to her. Out in the darkness the beasts were calling their calls and making every sort of noise, while here by the light, Max wasn't as afraid of them as he had been just hours before, because he was now a thing transformed. He'd pondered imponderable thoughts and come to dark decisions, as he grew more and more certain that the only way to survive in such a place as this was to become one of them. Just like the creatures beyond the light, Max was now a fell beast of these woods, and none of these foolish sleeping people knew what a terrible danger sat so quietly among them, regarding them without compassion or mercy, with his cold reptile eyes. When another hour had passed, Max gently shook his father awake. "It's your time to stand guard," Max whispered close into his ear. Slowly his father came awake, carefully extricating himself from his makeshift bed so that he didn't wake Mother. He stood up, found his boots and sword belt, and put them on. Then He led Max a small distance away from the others so that their talk wouldn't disturb them. "Can you keep watching for another few minutes, son, while I step into the woods a ways and make my water?" Father said, "And then, when I return, if you're not in too much of a hurry to get back to sleep right away, I'd like to have a private talk with you about some of the decisions I've made lately." "You mean about giving Frost to Peter?" Max asked. "Yes, that and other things." "Of course, Father. I'll stay up as long as you like." "Thank you. I won't be long." And with that, Father turned and stepped gingerly into the darkness, pausing once at the edge of the firelight to turn and say, "I'm proud of the way you acted today. I'm proud to see my first son grow into so steadfast and reliable a man." Max, the great swordsman, the hero of many a legend, would have been elated to hear those words from his father, as would simple Max Piper, the 14-year-old boy. But they were both absent just now. It was Max, the beast of the woods, who heard and cared not at all. He waited for a few seconds, listening to the faint sounds of his father walking off into the forest. Then he followed, stooping down once before he left the circle of firelight to pick up the biggest stone he could carry in one hand. He stalked through the night, and being who he now was, he made little sound and stumbled not at all. He crept deftly and silently around tree and root and ducked under intervening branches. Max found his father with his back to him, splashing his night water against the base of a tree. Max approached, and his father turned, alerted by a small sound, or maybe just the presence of another creature so close to him. "You should be back with the others, son. You're still on guard until I'm done." Max raised the stone and struck down hard on his father's skull. Father wobbled in place, looking at Max with an odd expression, which wasn't only due to the now distorted shape of his head, sunken and indistinct on one side. Yes, there was confusion in his expression, and maybe some pain as well. It was hard to tell for certain in the dark, but mostly Max thought he saw a look of deep regret in his father's eyes. "Max," Father said. His hands lost their ability to grip the trousers he'd unlaced to make his water, so the trousers collapsed down around his ankles. The sword he'd never even tried to unsheathe clattered loudly against some unseen rock or root on the ground. The stone in Max's hand was wet now. He struck again, and his father fell like a dropped bag of onions. Something warm had splashed Max's face. His father, lying crumpled at his feet, reached out weakly with one trembling hand, trying to touch Max, but then it fell, unmoving by his side. Max knelt next to his father and hit him again and again with a slippery stone. He continued doing it for a long time, and when he'd finished and stood up again, his father was no longer there. No discernible man at all existed in the grim pile of ruined meat and spilled wetness at his feet. Max dropped the stone and drew Frost-Taker from its sheath, intending to plunge it a few times into the mess below. But then he thought, "No, I'll wait to let Frost-Taker drink for the first time from the child thief who stole my inheritance." So he turned, with the blade still in his hand, and walked back towards the firelight, which was partially obscured by the trees of the great and terrible Black Forest, his home.